Thank you very much. And thank you again for having invited me here to give me the opportunity to show you the work of the OECD regarding labor market integration of immigrants and their children. So my presentation will focus more on Estonia, but I will compare Estonia with two different set of countries. On one hand, what I called other Eastern and Central European countries, that by facility I called neighboring countries, even if they are not always neighbors from Estonia, and the other EU and OECD countries as well. But first, what are we, if it's working, again, that's probably, well, there's always a slight delay, I think. Yeah, good, thank you. So first, what are we talking about when we're talking about multicultural society or diverse society? So in the OECD, we talk about population with a migrant background, which means either people who are born abroad, foreign-born, or either native-born people who have at least one foreign-born or two foreign-born parents. And so we can see in that figure, no, there's maybe something that is important to know, especially in the Estonian context. So by country of birth, we consider the current borders, not those at the time of birth, which of course make a huge difference in Estonia and in other neighboring countries, where the immigrant population has been built by change of borders and regional migration of national minorities. So my colors are here pretty standard in red. So I will show it here. So in red, it's always Estonia. In orange, this is all Eastern and Central European countries. And in blue, other countries. And with that specific patterns, this is the OECD and the EU total average. So what can we see here? We can see that a fifth of the OECD population has a migrant background, but this is a third in Estonia, but less than a tenth in most neighboring countries. What I found it very interesting is to see that, in fact, Estonia is closer from what we call the settlement countries, like Australia or Canada, in terms of numbers than closer to their other neighboring countries. So of course, Latvia, as you can see, is in a closer position from Estonia compared to other neighboring countries. So we're talking about great numbers. This is my point with this figure. So my presentation is divided into two parts. First, I will show you labor market outcomes, how the foreign-born compare with the native-born in the Estonian context compared to other EU and OECD countries. And first, I will try to give some key factors that are explaining why there is issue and how to address them. So the main indicator we used when we talk about labor market integration, of course, this is employment, because employment, as we already said, is key for immigrants' integration into the society. But as we can see, immigrants are less in employment than natives in most countries. This is the case in Estonia, and again in almost all Central European countries, but not always, as we can see here, for Latvia and Slovenia, for instance. And what is really interesting is to see that the gap in employment rate, so the gap between foreign-born and native-born, is in fact much smaller in Estonia and other neighboring countries compared to other EU countries. If we look at Sweden here, or the Netherlands, or Finland, the gaps in employment rates are as high as almost 20 percentage points. Whereas in other countries, or in Estonia, it's 4 or 5 points maximum. So, another example of this are unemployment rates, which is another indicator that we are using. Immigrant unemployment, we can see, is a tremendous issue in all EU countries, and especially for those born outside the EU. This is important to notice, and I forget to tell you that the markers are non-EU foreign-born. And we can see that in most Central and Eastern European countries, most of the immigrant population is in fact born inside the EU, which is not the case, as you know, in Estonia and Latvia. But in other countries, this is the case. So that's why it's important to compare non-EU foreign-born with native-born. And as we can see here, we can see that the markers are well above in all countries. So that means that immigrants are more likely, to be in unemployment than other countries. This is true in Estonia and everywhere else, with significant gaps. And again, more significant gaps in Western or Nordic or Southern Europe compared to Central and Eastern Europe. But what is important? Labor market is something. Employment rates, access to the labor market is something, but it's not really enough to have a job. You also need to have what we say a good job. What I mean by that is the quality of job is also very important. And the problem is that in terms of all kinds of job quality indicators like share of temporary contracts, job skills, and as shown here, overqualification rates, in fact, the quality of immigrants' job is poorer than that of the native-born. Again, in almost all countries. So this figure shows the overqualification rate. The overqualification rate for the highly educated, and we can see that in Estonia, this rate is twice as high among foreign-born compared to native-born. So which is the gap that we can see in other countries like France, Southern Europe, Nordic countries. So access to the labor market is something, but still, if you don't have a job that allows you to unleash your full potential, this is also an issue. So we are not only talking about labor market integration, but really employment jobs characteristics. So among the immigrant population, there are some groups that have other disadvantages, and foreign-born women, in fact, in almost all countries, they face a double disadvantage. So the disadvantage of, because immigrants are less likely to be employed, and women are less likely to be employed. So here we're showing the labor market participation rates or activity rates. And as we can see, again, in all countries, the markers are again non-EU foreign-born, because it's a bigger issue for non-EU foreign-born. In all countries, immigrant women are less likely to participate to the labor market compared to their native-born women. So this is the case in Estonia, this is the case in most Central and Eastern European countries, but again, there are some exceptions. But what is important is that when we look at native-born, foreign-born, born outside the EU, the participation rates are even lower. And this is the big issue in some countries of Western Europe, like France, Germany, etc. So there is here a double disadvantage. So the gender aspect is also an important aspect to take into account when we're looking at labor market integration. So, if I can conclude very quickly, or summarize very quickly what I just said, is that immigrants are less likely to integrate into the labor market in virtually all European countries and virtually all OECD countries. This is the case in Estonia, even if this is to a lesser extent compared to countries, Nordic countries, or Southern European countries, or even France, Germany, and all the so-called EU 15 countries. But the fact that this is an issue doesn't mean that this is the only issue. There is another additional issue, and we are talking about diverse communities. So as said before, we're not only talking about immigrants, we're talking about children of immigrants as well. Native-born who have been born in the host country from foreign-born parents. And what we see that the immigrant disadvantage is transmitted to their native-born children. So here it's an example. So we take here the group of people with low-educated parents only. And we can see that if we have low-educated parents, and immigrant parents, you are less likely to be in employment compared to native-born with low-educated native-born parents. And we can see that the difference is pretty important in some countries like Belgium or Slovenia. So unfortunately, we don't have data for Estonia in that case. But provisional data that we already have but are not finalized show that there is the same issue in Estonia, meaning that native-born with foreign-born parents are less likely to be integrated in the labor market compared to native-born with native-born parents. So why this is an issue? Because children of immigrants that are born in the country should not face the same issues as immigrants because they have been educated in the same country. So they have enjoyed the same education system, which is not the case for immigrants, of course. And so the fact that they still fare worse than their peers with no migrant background is a real threat for social cohesion. Because we like to say at the OECD that children of immigrants are in fact the benchmark for integration. Because immigrants, we all know that for immigrants, integration takes time. But for children of immigrants that are born in the host country, this is the real benchmark for integration. If they don't have the same labor market outcomes or other integration outcomes than their peers with no migrant background, this is a real issue. So, what are the factors? So, second part of my presentation, what are the factors hampering labor market integration and how to address them? We will see that some of those factors impact all population, all people with a migrant background. Some others impact mainly immigrants only. So, first of all, the level of education. Well, in most EU countries, labor market outcomes of immigrants are lower because immigrants are less educated on average. And since education improves the labor prospects, mechanically the average employment rate is lower in countries who receive a lot of low-educated immigrants. However, this is not a real argument in many respects. So first of all, this is not an argument in Estonia and in other neighboring countries, because in these countries, in fact, immigrants are more likely to be highly educated compared to native-born. And the second thing is that we show here in this figure are the difference of employment rates between foreign-born and immigrant by level of education. And we can see that if we look at the highly educated, here, so it's the circle, the employment rates gap is huge in many countries, including in Estonia. So that means that the employment rate of highly educated foreign-born is 10 percentage points lower than that for the native-born in Estonia, which is also the case in France, Belgium, or in Greece. So there are gaps for every country. So highly educated immigrants are less likely to be in employment in every country. This is not necessarily the case, as we can see, for other countries and for low-educated immigrants. There are some countries like Hungary, Italy, the Czech Republic, where low-educated immigrants, in fact, outperform low-educated native-born in terms of access to employment. But for highly educated, there is a real issue. And why? So why are highly educated immigrants fare worse than their native-born counterparts? So part of the explanation is that virtually every labor market in the OECD discounts foreign tertiary degrees. I take here the example of overqualification again. So I'm comparing overqualification rate by place of education. So in blue, foreign-born who have been trained abroad, and in gray, foreign-born who have been trained in the host country. And as we can see, the difference is significant for Estonia, is significant in most other EU countries, not always really significant for other Central and Eastern European countries. So what is important to say here is, though the same conclusion occurred for employment rates. If we look at employment rate by place of education, foreign educated people, immigrants, are less likely to be employed than foreign-born educated in the host country. So what is important here is that by many respects, we did a lot of different studies on these issues. And what we can see in OECD countries is that the procedures of recognition of foreign qualification do not work in many countries, and should be strengthened. They are, in many countries, too complicated to be understood by the immigrants. They are not facilitated, and sometimes that simply do not exist at all. And of course, without a recognized degree, you cannot integrate into the labor market as easily as if you have a recognized one. So something else that we have already talked about quite a bit is, of course, the host country language, which is another important factor explaining why there are gaps in labor market integration. When it comes to foreign-born who speak the native language, we can see that the gap in employment rate are, in fact, insignificant. Very, very small, and most of the time insignificant. So there's no difference between immigrants and native-born if immigrants talked the host country language. This is, however, not true for those who speak a foreign language. You can see that the gaps are, again, big. Unfortunately, we don't have data for Estonia here because we used the PIAC survey, so Adult Skills Assessment Survey of the OECD. And as you may know, in Estonia, the questionnaire has been implemented in both Russian and Estonian. So it's not easily possible to distinguish Russian and Estonian that are both considered in native language, statistically speaking. So that's why. But anyway, if it's the case in all countries that the language make a difference and is a problem everywhere, that means that it's probably a problem in Estonia, and maybe it's even more a problem because, as you can see, Estonia is in fact the OECD country with the least advanced proficiency for host country language proficiency for immigrants. That means that 20% of immigrants living in Estonia have an advanced language proficiency in Estonian. If we look at the EU or OECD average, this is 60%. And we can see that this is also an important issue in Latvia, Slovenia, Lithuania, but I won't really elaborate on that because we talk a lot about language. But we talk about language in education, but what can we do for immigrants, for people who are living in the country and who are already adults? What most of OECD countries have done is that they have increased the offer for publicly funded language training. But those trainings should not be only, you have a right to 200 hours of language training or 400 hours. They should be modulated by the labor market needs of a different group of immigrants. That means that an analphabet immigrants should not have the same language training as an highly educated immigrants. That makes perfect sense, but in most countries this is still the case. Maybe one statistic example which shows the importance of the language trainings. We looked at EU-wide the access to language courses and the impact on the language proficiency, and we can see that in recent migrants who attend language courses in the EU have a 10 percentage point higher chance to have an advanced proficiency compared to those who have not attended. So, all empirical studies show that when we take all those factors into account, language, education, place of education, etc., there are still gaps in labor market outcomes for almost every country. So those gaps still remain, and part of this unexplained gap are two things. The first thing is the lack of network that clearly hampers immigrants and their children to unleash their full potential. So I don't have data on this. Unfortunately, we have only preliminary data that I cannot show you. But I can tell you that we saw that Estonia, as well as all other neighboring countries, are the countries where the interaction between the native-born and the immigrant population is the lowest. So that means that few interactions between immigrants and native-born in the workplace, few integration in neighboring countries, and of course those interactions that help immigrants to build their own professional network. The second thing that is also very difficult to measure is discrimination. So, when we look at different social surveys in the EU, we can see that around 15% of the immigrant population consider themselves as part of a discriminated group. This is relatively the same share for Estonia. The share could be, as you can see, higher in other countries. But I think what is the most important thing here to state is that, in fact, when we look at native-born with immigrant parents, they feel more discriminated than their parents in almost all European countries, including Estonia. You see 20% versus 15%. Which is interesting is that this is not the case in non-European countries. In Canada, the United States, New Zealand, for instance, immigrants feel themselves, it's a self-perception discrimination, so it's a question. They feel themselves more discriminated than their children. But in Europe, this is the other way around, which is, again, maybe the biggest issue that we have to face. So we really need to tackle discrimination to build a more cohesive society, because otherwise, the next generation will consider themselves even more and more discriminated. So, I think I'm done with all those descriptive things. I apologize a bit, maybe too much of them. What we're trying to do at the OECD is to give some recommendations to governments to allow them, because we can share best practices, in fact. We know a lot of best practices because we have a 36 country now international organization, so we can share which is the best practice to tackle those issues of integration. And I think integrating immigrants here, I summarize the framework for policy option. So the first thing is using the skills of immigrants, making sure that their skills are used to their full potential by recognition of foreign qualification, by gaining experience, and by accessing help. We also need to develop their skills, because developing critical missing skills with strategic investment in, again, language courses, access for children to early childhood education, we haven't talked about that, but it's a real issue in many OECD countries, and apprenticeship, and for adults, offering bridging courses and further training to upscale the skills. And then, third important thing, we need to activate some skills, because immigrants, most of them are already skilled, but they are not just recognized as skilled migrants. So we need to ensure that skills are not wasted by remaining inactive. So we need activating immigrants, especially the youth and women. We need the help of the employers. We need to overcome discrimination, and of course we have all activating immigrants as employers, give access to entrepreneurship to immigrants. And there is, I think, something that I missed, but time is up. So just to tell you a last word, that most of those data are coming from this publication, Settling in Indicators of Immigrant Integration, and that a new updated version of Settling In will be released very soon on the 9th of December. Thank you.